Senator Dean, on debate.
Thank you, Your Honour. Honourable Senators, I rise today to speak to Bill C-63, a second act to implement certain provisions of the budget tabled in Parliament on March 22, 2017, and other measures, or the Budget Implementation Act, as it appears in its short title. I would like to particularly speak to Part 4, and not surprisingly perhaps, which refers to the Federal Provincial Fiscal Arrangements Act. Presently, the Federal Provincial Fiscal Arrangements Act does not provide the necessary authorities for the Minister of Finance to enter into coordinated cannabis taxation agreements with provinces and territories, which is, of course, the essence of the Act and reflects similar federal provincial fiscal approaches. Currently, the Minister of Finance has this authority with respect to tax collection agreements and sales tax harmonisation agreements. On the question of undue haste, I feel compelled to remind honourable senators that the government's intention to introduce legislation to legalise and strictly regulate cannabis was made known on December the 4th, 2015. An expert task force was struck on July 30th, 2016. Legislation was introduced in April 2017. All of that against the backdrop of our country Canada, which has had a robust medical cannabis framework in place for several years. The amendments to the Federal Provincial Fiscal Arrangements Act would ensure that a coordinated cannabis taxation framework is established well in advance of non-medical cannabis potentially being legalised in a planned way. The proposed amendments to the Federal Provincial Fiscal Arrangements Act will allow the Minister of Finance, on behalf of the Government of Canada, to enter into agreements with interested provinces and territories concerning a coordinated taxation framework for cannabis, something provinces and territories have clearly been interested in doing. It's necessary that the Minister of Finance be designated this authority in order to ensure a streamlined, coordinated and planned approach for the potential implementation of the legalisation and regulation of cannabis, which is the objective, as we've just heard a few moments ago, of Bill C-45 presently before this chamber. The government must be able to strike appropriate agreements between the provinces and territories regarding the price and taxation of cannabis and have sufficient time to do so. The risks of harms associated with cannabis use is a necessary factor to be considered when trying to strike a balance in price and taxation for cannabis products. Appropriate pricing controls can discourage use of cannabis and provide the government with revenues to offset related costs. However, pricing cannabis too high may drive users to the illicit market. In its 2016 report, the Task Force on the Legalisation and Regulation of Cannabis recommended taxes should be high enough to limit the growth of consumption, but low enough to compete effectively with the illicit market. In order to achieve this, the Task Force recommended the federal government work with provinces and territories to determine a tax regime that includes equitable distribution of revenues, and that this work result in a flexible system that can adapt price and tax with a changing marketplace. Honourable Senators, if the amendments to the Federal Provincial Fiscal Arrangements Act are not adopted now in advance of the potential legalisation of cannabis, the government will be unable to conclude fiscal negotiations between the provinces and territories. It's essential for the federal government to have the flexibility and the authorities necessary to ensure that such a framework is in place both in a timely and predictable fashion in order to be responsive to governments and its partners. The government began engaging with the province and territories on the issue of pricing and taxation shortly after the legislation was introduced in the House of Commons in the spring. It was an item on the agenda at the First Minister's meeting, June 18th and 19th, 6 months ago, and a revenue split proposal was presented to the Premiers at the Premiers' meeting on October the 3rd. In addition, on November the 10th, 2017, the government announced the publication of a public consultation paper on the proposed price and taxation of cannabis products and engaged with governments and stakeholders on these proposals through until December the 7th. I can say with certainty, because as you do, honourable colleagues, work hard to fulfil my constitutional responsibility to engage with my region, I can say with certainty that officials of the province of Ontario have been deeply engaged and continually consulted on cannabis reform over the past 18 months. Nothing has been rushed about it. And Ontario, just for your information, will be ready on July the 1st. It was proposed that the combined rate of tax for cannabis flowering material contained in a final packaged product should not exceed $1 per gram or 10% of the producer's sale price of that product, whichever is higher, with this tax room divided equally between the province or territory and the federal government. After further consultations on the initial proposal and after the Finance Minister's meeting in Ottawa on Monday, you will know that the government reached a deal that would increase the proposed share to the province and territories from 50% to 75% of tax revenues from the sale of legal cannabis over the next 2 years. This agreement would also see any tax revenue in excess of $100 million go to the provinces and territories. Finance Minister Morneau announced that the federal government, provinces and territories would meet again in December 2018 to assess how this deal is working should C-45 be enacted. However, in the absence of the amendments proposed in C-63 under Part 4, the government will not have the necessary authorities to solidify these important agreements that are responsive to regional impacts and costs for the legalisation and regulation of cannabis. It was also proposed that revenues raised from the taxation regime would help support investments in public education, enforcement, research and other activities integral to an effective system of legalisation and regulation of cannabis. This is the sort of certainty that province and territories have been seeking. And given all of our concerns about appropriate cannabis-related resources for provinces and territories, I know that you will all want to be supportive of this. The proposed amendments in the Federal Provincial Fiscal Arrangement Act would permit the federal government to formalise cannabis taxation agreements. It's important that the province and territories have the ability to negotiate on pricing regimes that consider their regional interests and individual cannabis frameworks for the protection of all governments, stakeholders and Canadians. A streamlined approach to pricing and taxation will ensure that the public health and safety of Canadians is protected in the way that all of us here would want to see. I encourage all honourable senators to vote in favour of Bill C-63. The amendments in Part 4 are necessary to coordinate the effective implementation of legalisation and regulation of cannabis should this be approved by Parliament. Thank you very much.